YouTube, Big Smoke 58 here. Welcome back. You know, there's a lot of discussion on forums and media outlets, specifically about Smith & Wesson revolvers. Some of that discussion is about the older revolvers versus the newer modern revolvers. You know, which one's better? And I think a lot of that all came about specifically around two things. The use of MEM parts, MEM, M-I-M, which stands for metal injection molding versus forged parts, and then the use of the internal trigger lock system on their revolvers versus the older vintage revolvers that didn't have that. Now I know a lot of this stuff is, you know, all individualized to what you like or prefer versus what you don't like or don't prefer. I think for the most part, most of those things are just aesthetics. But when you do a real apples to apples comparison, there's really not that much difference between the two guns. Now, I've got two revolvers here. Both are Smith & Wesson model 686s. This is a vintage gun, or older one, a 686-3. This is the modern gun, which is a 686-6. Now, one of the differences between these two guns is this one has a 7-shot cylinder, where this one has a 6-shot cylinder. They both have 2.5-inch barrels, and they're both .357 Magnums. Both are equipped with combat stocks, both are round butts. So what I want to do today is an apples to apples comparison between these two revolvers, and maybe show you that there's really not a whole lot of difference between them. At least not enough to keep spawning that argument about which is better or which is worse. That it all boils down to each individual as to what they prefer and what they like. And it's not anything that's inherent in either one of the guns that, in my opinion, is still basis for that discussion. Now, nothing that I'm going to talk about today is scientific. I don't have a scale. I don't have a trigger pull gauge. I don't have any precision measuring instruments. I'm going to use the instruments that really matter the most when you're talking down to which is better, and that's your hands, your eyes, and your personal senses. In the end, that's all that really matters. The one that feels best to you is the one that's best. And it's the same thing with the weight. Nobody, I mean, is it really going to matter if the gun weighs 34 ounces versus 32 ounces? If you're going to carry the gun, I would say, yeah, it may matter. But if 2 ounces of carry is going to matter that much to you, maybe it's not the right gun for you to carry in the first place. So again, this is just my opinion. It's nothing scientific. It's just, I just believe that one personal preferences is what really matters. So let's look at some of the differences between the modern gun versus the vintage gun. So aesthetically speaking, we're going to start from the top and work our way down the revolver. Now I may jump around from place to place, and for that, just kind of bear with me. Now, what jumps out right from the start is the frame design on the modern gun versus the vintage gun. On the frame design on the modern gun, first off, you have the internal lock system on the modern gun, where on the vintage guns you do not. That was something that Smith & Wesson started around, I think, year 2000 or 2001, and it's been with their revolvers ever since. And from what I've read, and that's not going to change, because I think the company that actually make these trigger lock systems currently has a huge stake in Smith & Wesson, or they own Smith & Wesson. So I wouldn't anticipate that going away no time soon. The second difference between them that's kind of obvious to you is the frame design. This is the new frame design, where this is the old frame design. Now the old frame design, you still had the cylinder stop lug, and it kind of went away with this design, but it's still there, but it seems to be a little bit more aesthetically pleasing to the eye with the frame design here. The other difference between the frames is the shape of the rear sight and the front sight. Now the front sight on the vintage revolver was it was still forged as part of the frame, and the front sight on the modern gun is not actually part of the frame, but it's actually been milled in and pinned in place, and it's a blackened sight with the red insert. Now some people prefer this design because they say you can always change this sight out if you prefer to use something else, and it's easier to see because it's black with a red insert. I prefer this design because I just like it better. It's not a case whether it's easier or less easy to pick up in the sight picture. It's just the design that I prefer. The vintage gun has the traditional cylinder thumb release, which is kind of wide and flat, where the new modern gun has the tapered thumb piece. Again, more differences in the mostly aesthetics. The vintage gun still has the serrations on the grip tang on the rear and on the front, where they did away with that on all of the modern guns. They're not serrated anymore. They're all smooth, and I'm sure that was done just to save cost in manufacturing. Incorporated that in their new frame design across all of their guns, except when they reintroduced the older vintage guns in their classics. Here's where it gets kind of personal to a lot of people. The MIM trigger and hammer versus the forged trigger and hammer, and subsequently the hammer mounted firing pin versus the modern gun that has the frame mounted firing pin. Now when you actually use the guns, as I have, there is no operational difference between the two. There's really no trigger difference between the two. Now these guns both have, I think, the same trigger pull. And that's in the single action and or double action. Now I would honestly say that this particular vintage gun single action pull is a little lighter than this gun, probably only because it's a lot older and it's been shot and worked in more. I think as this gun gets to be shot and used more, it will probably work in, and they'll probably be equal in single and double action trigger pull. Now there's not a lot of difference between the two, very little, but I would venture to say that this one's probably better just because it's older. But between the two of them, I would say the difference is just negligible. I don't know what the pull difference is in terms of poundage, but on my trigger finger, it's only slight. The guns are exactly the same size. Dimensionally, they are. They're the same length, same height, same cylinder diameter. This one just has 7 shots. This one just has 6. As far as the weight goes, I don't have a scale. I don't need a scale because it's all about how it feels to you. This vintage gun feels like it's slightly heavier, and I mean ever so slightly, just heavier than this modern gun. Now that may be more attributed to the difference in metallurgical science with these newer guns versus the older guns. You're talking about almost 25 years difference between the manufacturer of this gun versus this one. Actually, there's been some improvement in metallurgy, so that the steel on this gun probably stronger and maybe even lighter than the steel that was used to make this gun. But we're talking about ounces, not pounds. It probably won't matter to the user or the owner which one is heavier. But this gun, the Smith & Wesson logo actually was stamped in, which I do prefer, whereas these modern guns, it's more kind of laser etched. And that's just on the frame. The stamping on the barrels is the same. It's been stamped. On the modern gun, it's just as it's been stamped on the vintage gun. The fit and feel in the hand, it's exactly the same. I mean, it just feels exactly the same. So when it comes down to which one's better, who knows? I mean, it boils more down to which one do you prefer over the other. I think both these guns are equally as reliable and equally as dependable. I think from a functionality standpoint, the only concern that I think most people have is the MEM parts versus the forged parts, and the internal trigger lock versus the guns that don't have the internal trigger lock. Now, I don't know of anyone personally that has ever had a problem with any of these Smith & Wesson revolvers that have the internal trigger locks on them. Now, I've read on some forums and seen on some videos that there have been occurrences where these locks have failed and caused the gun to malfunction. And for anyone to assume that that may not ever happen is being unrealistic, because it's a man-made item. It's got internal moving parts, and parts do fail. You know, things do malfunction. But I'll be willing to go on a limb and think that if there's been 1 million trigger pulls, the failure rate on those guns are less than 1 million to 1. And I don't know that. I'm just speaking my opinion. Which one of these do I prefer? Well, I prefer the vintage gun only for aesthetic reasons, and that's it alone. I'm not a critic of these guns. It's taken a while for them to grow on me. I bought my first gun with an internal lock on it just a few years ago, and I've enjoyed that gun just as much as I've enjoyed all the rest of them. The only thing that I don't enjoy is looking at that internal lock. But after I've owned it for a while, it doesn't scream at me like it used to. It's just one of those things that once you have it, you realize that that's what I have and that's what it's going to be. But in terms of these two guns, in my honest opinion, one's not better than the other. I think from a manufacturing standpoint, they're both very well made. I think they're both high quality firearms. I think the fit and finish is excellent on both. I think the tolerances are great on both. It's just that this gun has a redesigned frame and the use of MEM parts. This gun has the original frame design and still has forged parts in it. But in either one of these guns, you're going to buy a good, high quality firearm that will give you years and years or decades of trouble-free use. And I think regardless of circumstance, if you're a person that loves revolvers and you love shooting them, you're going to love shooting this gun just as much as you love shooting that gun. Because in the hand and in the operation, aside from what you see, you will not experience or feel any difference between the two. Listen, I appreciate you watching. Until the next time, it's Big Swole 58.